Hello, my name is Faustine Goldberg-Sigal. I'm speaking to you from Paris, where I live. I grew up and I now work as Moishe House's International Director of Jewish Education, which means I usually travel a lot, definitely not these months. Thanks to you for joining me in this short learning, and thanks to Yesod for giving me the opportunity to share it with you. So as I was reading the parsha, I was reminded of one of my favorite speakers ever, whose name is Esther Perel. Some of you might also be fans of her. She is a psychotherapist, born and raised in Antwerp in Belgium, now living in New York, where she's an incredibly popular TED Talk speaker, podcast author, therapist, of course. She specializes in human relationships and often the tensions between the different needs, such as freedom and security and things like this. And one of the experiences she speaks of frequently is her young years, her childhood, surrounded by a community of Holocaust survivors. And one of the things she said that was very clear to her is the difference that there was between the people who survived the camp and the people who had started living again. And she says, very early on, I understood the difference between not being dead and being alive, and that those two things were very different, and that you could see how those different people stood differently, sat differently, spoke differently, raised their children differently, ate differently, and even physically you could see the difference between how different resilience strategies would impact people's lives. And Judaism does have a wording to acknowledge this. There is a blessing we often say where we're doing something for the first time or for the first time in a long time, which is called Shehecheyanu. Some of you might know it. It goes Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam shehecheyanu v'kiyemanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. It's one of my favorite blessings. The translation is, blessed are you, God, etc., etc. Shehecheyanu, who made us live, v'kiyemanu, and made us exist, or thrive maybe, v'higiyanu lazman hazeh, and got us to the point where we are right now. And I think it's important that we're not just blessing the fact that we're alive, we're saying like being alive can be a combination of very different things, and to get to a point where life is a blessing, it does take the addition or several steps or layers. Another beautiful wording for this reality of what is a textured life, what is a thriving life, is in this week's parsha, in Parshat Re'eh. So we're right now reading the last book of the Torah, which is called Deuteronomy, Dvarim in Hebrew, which is pretty much the Testament. How do you say this? Testament, the last words, final speech of Moses to the Bnei Israel, the Israelites in the desert. And in this week's parasha, we're reading one of probably the most famous sentences of the Bible of all time. I'll read to you in Hebrew and in English. It's chapter 30, verse 19. Heidoti bachem hayom et hashamayim v'et haaretz, hachaim v'amavet, natati lefanecha habracha v'haklala, uvachachta v'chaim, leman tichye ata v'zaracha. In English, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore, choose life, so that you may live, you and your seed. And I think this gives us a very striking insight into human relationship with authority and into the scope of our agency. We might think, oh, now that they have the revelation, now that they have the Torah, now that they have a very clear authority, they don't need to choose anything for them. Choices are made. It's very straightforward. And this teaches us something very different. It tells you basically that healthy authority, be it God, the Torah, universal values, climate science, your parents' advice, the user's manual, however you want to call it, cannot and should not erase the possibility of choice, and especially of bad choices, of negative choices, of deadly choices even. Death always remains an option, curse always remains an option. They're still there, they're there right along life and blessing. And what matters in the end is not the suppression of evil, but maybe on the contrary, our capacity to make our own choices. And by using our free will to choose life, we're demonstrating that we're humans, and to some extent we are demonstrating that we are chosen. By choosing, we're being chosen. And I think it's only by making active choices sometimes tough choices, that we can actually deserve to be alive and enjoy being alive. It's not just an option we have. It's not like, oh, you want vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream. I think meaningful choices are a human and a Jewish and a biblical responsibility, precisely because there is an alternative. If there is no alternative, there is no choice. And if there is no choice, there is no life. At this point in 2020, I think it's probably very clear to us all that things can go wrong. Evil exists, death exists, morbidity is a presence in our lives. So many things could go wrong. Human bodies, economies, relationships, governments, projects, agricultural yields, and all of those things. And it's also very clear to us, which is more interesting, that small gestures of each and every one of us can make a difference. Sometimes we think, okay, maybe there are bad things, but at the end of the day, my presence in there doesn't really matter because they will happen anyways. But no, we learned in so many ways that 5 minutes of our time can make a huge difference. Think about calling a loved one who might be isolated. Think about making a small donation to a project, helping homeless people or farmers who are having a rough time right now. Think of wearing a mask. All the things you can do by just wearing this very small thing on your face. So this is what I want to stick with, and I'll reread the sentence from the Torah one last time before I wrap this up. העידותי בכם היום את השמיים ואת הארץ, החיים והמוות, נתתי לפניך הברכה והקללה, ובחרת בחיים למען תחיה אתה וזרעך. I call heaven and earth to witness against you, also against us, this day, that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore, choose life so that you may live, you and your seed. And I want to remember this double insistence in the verse that said, choose life so that you may live. If you don't choose life, you won't live. And if you don't live, you cannot be able to choose life. So I wish us all on this Shabbat that we all find the strength to accept and celebrate the onus of permanently renewing our commitment to life and to blessing, and to continue to walk through this crazy 2020 that we're living right now, one brave choice at a time. L'chaim and Shabbat Shalom.